You're late, the vampire bride at the reception desk said in admonishing tones. Did anything happen? No, but you're still late. The mistress says that we must strive to maintain punctual operations. The vampire bride picked up her clipboard from the stone counter and produced a pen. She looked up at Elishnish, who had reassumed her dragony self after sending the old dwarf away and finding a new place out of view. What did you find out? The vampire bride asked, awaiting Elishnish's report. That dwarves are stubborn, prideful and mired in traditions and history that they themselves have half forgotten, Elishnish replied. That they are not as honorable as they might pretend to be. A few of them seem a bit more sensible than the rest, though. That does not help with our present circumstances in any way. Though the vampire bride said that, her pen didn't stop moving, continuing to scroll notes in some unknown language. I might have given them a slight nudge, Elishnish said offhandedly, for all the good it will do for anyone. They're currently disputing the ownership of their lairs, and their masters did not prepare the appropriate measures to manage them properly. It's only a matter of time before things grind to a halt again if it hasn't already. Let's have some details. The vampire bride tapped her pen on the clipboard. Perhaps Lady Shiltia will be able to do something about this. Elishnish's tongue twitched, and the flesh beneath her scales prickled. Lady Shiltia is coming? Now? We've relayed a request for an expedited delivery through the set of frost dragons that left before you arrived, the vampire bride replied. They should have arrived at Theorizo by now. Elishnish relayed her findings to the vampire bride, who recorded her words without pause. She omitted the meeting in the alley, however, it seemed to matter little in regards to the business at hand. You managed to do all of that in just over an hour? Hegenmull marveled. That's amazing, sister. Considering that I'm a bard, brother, it shouldn't be, Elishnish sniffed. What have you been doing this entire time? Chatting with the office staff? Hegenmull offered shyly, getting stared at by all the passing dwarves, too, if that counts for anything. You'd think they'd have seen a dragon before, as long as they live. The vampire bride cleared her throat from the reception counter to the side. Is there anything else to report? She asked. The more information we have to work with, the better. That's all that pertains to this matter, Elishnish replied, unless you want every piece of idle conversation and gossip that came within range of my hearing for the last hour. Before the vampire bride could respond, a dark hole appeared in the yard in front of the converted office. A dozen giant lizards spilled out, followed by a pair of dwarf handlers. Lady Shiltia stepped through last, stopping to look over the dwarves and their unsettled livestock. The sight of them reminded Elishnish that she hadn't eaten for at least a week. When was the last time she had some lizard? Do you know your way from here? Lady Shiltia asked them. No, one of the dwarves answered as they checked over their animals, but we got a map, should be able to figure it out. Lady Shiltia extended an arm, pointing her gloved hand down a mostly empty road branching out from the main thoroughfare filled with cargo sledges waiting to get into the residential quarter. This delivery was requested by the Merchant Guildmaster, she said. He should be at the gate of the industrial quarter. The road here will lead you straight to him. That so? The dwarf handler said as he gathered up the reins of his lizards. Well, thank ye kindly, miss, you've saved us a lot of trouble. Don't know how we could have packed these fellows up in this weather. Lady Shiltia smiled as they waved and went on their way, then she turned and headed straight into the office. Thank you for your hard work, Lady Shiltia. The vampire brides lined up and bowed in greeting. Are we making any headway here? She asked. We've slowed down departures on our end, but that just means all the traffic is piling up in Theorizo instead. The dwarves keep bringing more and more things to the surface, despite being informed of the changes. The receptionist stepped forward to offer the information collected by Elishnish to her mistress, who scanned them over briefly. Whose work is all this? She peered suspiciously at the three vampire brides. You haven't left your post to wander around, I hope. They violently shook their heads in unison, and the receptionist quickly provided an answer. Number 19 went into the city to find out what she could since her flight is currently delayed. Number 19. Lady Shiltia's crimson gaze went from one frost dragon to the other, then wrinkled her nose. Oh, the obscene one. Well, I guess she's at least showing more use. Lady Shiltia seated herself behind the stone counter, poring over the notes again. After several minutes, she produced a scroll from a hole in the air before her. Message. The parchment vanished in a flash of vivid azure flame, and Elishnish watched as Lady Shiltia went through a curious sequence of expressions. The pen in hand scratched over the notes presented and, after several minutes, she rose with a smile on her face. "We will be altering the schedule according to the changes written here," she said as she looked over to Elishnish and Hegenmull. "You two, with me, break time's over." They flew up after Lady Shiltia as she streaked towards the cavern ceiling high above Theoburkana. She stopped to hover near one of the ventilation shafts over the industrial quarter that had been blocked off. "This one should be good enough, I think," Lady Shiltia murmured as she looked down to the city below. The vampire placed a hand on the colossal boulder stopping up the shaft and moved forward. There was little other way to describe it. The tiny figure advanced and the boulder, that must have been 4 times the mass of their father, appeared to have no choice but to advance with her. It scraped forward with no discernible effort on Lady Shiltia's part. A few seconds later, a great amount of debris tumbled down the mountain face and the stale air from within the cavern blasted past them and into the gloomy morning skies. "Our service will be using this shaft to access the city until further notice," Lady Shiltia said. "Head back to Fiojura. The cargo schedule should be reorganized to resume deliveries by the time you arrive." Elishnish and Hegenmull resumed their work, and the day continued uneventfully. Frost Dragon flights to and from Fiojura and Theoburkana were proceeding smoothly with the newly adjusted schedule. Smoothly? Wait a minute. Elishnish grew annoyed as she considered what she was doing. This was certainly not something she had volunteered to do. She was just packed away and the events of the past few days simply swept her along. The idea that she had developed a sense for what qualified as smooth operations for their tasks annoyed her even further. Was she really that airheaded, to simply go with the flow without realizing it? She needed to find a way out of her predicament. She didn't want a broom closet as a lair, nor did she want to be stuck with this damnably insidious routine. How long would they be doing this for, anyway? Until all of Fiojura had been emptied? At one point she heard that there were 100,000 dwarves packed in the satellite city somehow, and considering the whole day had barely moved 1,000, well, she did not want to be stuck flying her brother back and forth for months. Elishnish eyed the frantically flapping form of Hegenmull behind her. Truly, there was nothing graceful or majestic about the image he portrayed. "How long are we going to be doing this for, brother?" Elishnish asked after they leveled off from yet another departure from Theoburkana. "I heard that this was being done as a gesture of goodwill to the dwarves as well. Everything we're doing is free of charge or obligation." "As long as it takes, as far as I know," Hegenmull answered. "It shouldn't take more than a month or 2. After that, the service will be operating regularly along the routes within the Sorceress Kingdom, in addition to some friendly destinations like our winter and the dwarf cities." "So you're saying that they plan on having us do this indefinitely?" Elishnish turned an eye to him with a furrowed brow. "What do we even get for this?" "They subjugated the Enclave, sister." "I don't think we get anything. We have to do what they want." "That sounds suspiciously like slavery, Hegenmull. Didn't you say it was illegal?" "Well, there are rules and then there are rules, sister." Hegenmull did not sound like he cared either way. "You know how it is." Indeed she did, but it did not make her feel any better about it. The others appeared so resigned to their fates that even acting for one's own freedom felt like it would result in their turning against her. Actually, they did just that a few days ago. "You must have some different rules, brother, seeing how damnably upbeat you are all the time now." That's technically true, I guess." "Technically? What are you on about?" A pair of frost dragons crossed their path, flying a few hundred meters below them in the opposite direction. They did not even meet her gaze. She wondered if they even registered her presence. If they continued the way they were, inevitably some predator would end them. The storm over the mountains grew worse, but it mattered little to a frost dragon. Elishnish sliced through the razor winds and blinding snows with no more difficulty than she would through a gentle spring shower. It was perfect hunting weather for many of the powerful beings that made inclement frozen climes their home. She looked down to the rugged slopes below. Most of the frost giants she had marked over their many journeys back and forth were still there, and they could see through the storm just as easily as frost dragons could. The dwarf migration was quite the curiosity. She was sure many other denizens of the Azalisia ranges had taken note, but the frost giant clans were the only force that was probably capable of waylaying the caravans laden with the dwarves and their precious cargo. It would take a powerful group of them, however, and whether such a great raid would be assembled was not something a frost giant scout could alone decide. It occurred to her that she hadn't killed any recently. Usually, she would get rid of one or two who became too brave or careless and the rest would lay low for a while. Without their main competition vying for dominance over the territory, it was probably just a matter of time before they moved against the dwarves. She wondered if the Sorceress Kingdom would do anything after the fact. "Are you going to stop waffling and finally answer me?" she growled back at Hegenmull, who continued to remain silent as he followed her through the storm. "What happened to you? I'm starting to think that Mother was right about your strange behavior." "Well, I was actually the first of us to meet the Sorcerer King," Hegenmull said. "Father actually sent me out to deal with him." "Deal with him?" Ilishnish narrowed her eyes. "Negotiation is not the first option Father would ever choose." "Oh, no, of course not," Hegenmull laughed nervously. "He sent me out to kill the intruders." "He sent you out to fight?" Ilishnish scoffed. "It seems Father was an idiot in more ways than Mother described. I assume you just tried talking this Sorcerer King's ear off like you do with anyone whenever you get in a pinch." Pretty much, but the Sorcerer King just started casting something at me as soon as I asked what he was doing." "I see. I didn't realize my brother had become undead since we last met. I've read that the undead aren't prone to bouts of extreme emotion like the living, so I suppose things make sense now. If it's any consolation, you're very lifelike still, undead brother." "Yes, I've read that as well. Though I guess we did read all the same stuff, after all." "No, wait, I'm not undead." "Really, sister, don't just kill me off like that." "All right, what happened, then?" Well, after a brief discussion, I agreed to take him to meet Father and, along the way, he gave me to Lady Aura, a ranger vassal of his, and I sort of became a pet." They banked with the bend in the mountain road while Ilishnish tried to make sense out of what Hegenmull had just said. "A pet?" The words finally sunk in. "Aya? What do you mean by Aya?" 72 frozen faces snapped up to look towards them as her shout rolled over the sledges passing far below. Unbelievable. Simply incomprehensible. Her brother, a pet? There were many things one could strive for, but this was something that Ilishnish was quite certain stood as a first in the histories of the world. Dragons often achieved fame or infamy, but Hegenmull just ignored both to aim straight for ignominy. "I believe that you had at least some ambition, brother," Ilishnish spat. "How could you simply roll over and become someone's belonging?" "I don't believe my ambitions really mattered there," Hegenmull replied. "It just happened, and I had no choice." Plus, by being useful to them, her brother continued, "I was able to save Mother and the rest before the Sorcerer King decided to just kill them all. It's not as if my ambitions changed in the end. Anyways, I wanted to leave and see the world after learning all that I could. My schedule was just advanced slightly." Humph. Seeing the world as a delivery dragon is not what I had in mind when it came to the future. "A delivery dragon, that sounds pretty catchy, sister." Ilishnish threw him an annoyed look, and he hurriedly spoke again. Besides, this work means we can see the world without worrying for our safety as we would otherwise. Also, as Lady Aura's pet, there are all sorts of other perks. She has many abilities that can reinforce us and enhance our performance like your magic does." "No, that's not quite right." Don't tell me that the rest of the Enclave now belongs to her as well." "No, they're not insufferably upbeat like you are, and it wouldn't be Lady Shiltia directing things if so." "No, I was referring to all the others like me, the magical beasts and such who are also Lady Aura's pets. Maybe if you joined, you'd also—" "Oh, spare me, brother." Ilishnish cut him off. "If I ever gain an interest in this circus you've become a part of, it will be as a spectator. You'll never catch me becoming some ranger's lap lizard." The work with the dwarven migration continued for weeks, and Ilishnish no longer considered their work slavery. It was nowhere near as nice a thing as that. While the vampire brides posted at every office had a sort of cordial working relationship with the frost dragons, she felt that, as a whole, They were all simply used as livestock with a convenient set of traits rather than anything like a sort of skilled and intelligent slave. They were simply exploited for everything they had, with little regard for anything. They didn't need to eat due to their accessories, so they worked. There was no sickness and injuries, just regenerated, so they worked. Active dragons did not need sleep in the first place, so they worked. All of the natural advantages of their kind, their strength, speed, resilience and endurance, had become a curse rather than a blessing. The Quagga slaves that the frost dragons kept during Olisar Dark's reign were at least granted relative freedom when not set to various tasks. They were allowed to send their people wherever they pleased in the mountains, waging wars and expanding their quaint little empire. Basically everything was allowed as long as they paid their dues and did not challenge the authority of their masters. On the other hand, Ilishnish's life delivering parcels back and forth was nothing but pure drudgery, an endless schedule that spared them no reprieve on the job and little freedom. They were allowed a single day to reassemble their wits in whatever cramped accommodations could be found for them. At all other times, they were flying back and forth endlessly on their routes, all day and all night for a week straight. No, not even livestock was treated like this. It was more like they were being treated like the undead servitors that pulled cargo overland in a similar manner, or perhaps like the unfeeling, lifeless constructs that the dwarves had once employed to defend their royal palace in Feoburkana. Maybe working us to death is the actual goal. Ilishnish mulled over this idea for a minute or two. It probably wouldn't happen, given the ubiquitous trappings of efficiency that they had all been equipped with. They had been simply made as close to undead as possible, and ruthlessly worked in the same fashion. With Hegenmull as insufferably upbeat as he was due to his condition, Ilishnish wanted to ask her other broodmates how they felt about the whole arrangement. Since the problems of the first day, however, they never stopped for long enough for other flights to catch up to them. She brooded darkly on the wall of the Feojura outpost beside her brother, thinking about the upcoming day off that would be arriving shortly. The first 2 of these days had been in makeshift sheds set up in this same outpost, amidst the hustle and bustle of everything. Sleep was impossible and she was barred entry into the dwarf city, so the entire day was spent staring mindlessly at the endless procession of dwarves and their cargo being moved out of the city and onwards to Feoburkana. "Have I lost weight, sister?" Hegenmull asked while posing and sucking in his gut. "A bit," Ilishnish replied absently, flicking a chunk of ice off of the wall with a forklaw. "Oh, that's great. Perhaps we could celebrate with some deer or elk or nook." "No. But we haven't eaten for weeks. This can't be healthy." "Healthy?" Ilishnish forced herself to look at Hegenmull's corpulent form. "At this rate, we'll need to starve you for another year or so before you even look remotely healthy." "Come to think of it," she added, "I should just stop throwing so many enchantments on you. That way you'll melt off more of that fat faster. Even with us getting quicker over these past few weeks, all it results in is more work anyways. Lady Shiltia was giving us that funny look again when we nearly overtook the flight ahead of us last time." Hard work, as she had discovered, merely resulted in more work. Initially, they had been assigned with a rather languid schedule due to their dismal expectations for Hegenmull's performance. It was so infuriatingly slow that she used her magic to assume a more sane pace. She reasoned that, since they would come in ahead of schedule, they would have longer breaks between each delivery. Yet, within a day, they had been moved to the regular schedule that all of the other frost dragons were using. Lady Shiltia had a calculating look on her face just before this happened, then she had come before them personally with a beaming smile on her face that looked far too nice. "Your duties have been expanded," the vampire told them. "Isn't that wonderful?" Another infinite haversack was strapped onto her, and Lady Shiltia looked up like she had just bestowed a medal on a hero. Now, Lady Shiltia had that calculating look on her face again. What sort of insane person would be happy about being burdened with additional labors? She needed to scale down the enchantments on Hegenmull before her duties were expanded once more. A vampire bride appeared from behind a nearby snowdrift, followed by the 2 others who usually brought new cargo to be delivered. Ilishnish peered at the procession suspiciously. From seeing E-Rantel, Feoburkana, and Feojura, she understood that each post manned by representatives of the delivery service had exactly 3 vampire brides. One attended to the clients that came to drop off or pick up their orders at the front desk, also taking care of general administrative matters. The remaining two usually worked in the background, organizing inventories, tending to the frost dragons and sending various parcels on their way. Whenever the vampire bride posted at the front desk came to the back, it meant that something was wrong, or something was changing. Ilishnish eyed her warily. Unwelcome and unexpected change was usually a frost dragon's worst enemy. "Congratulations," the vampire bride receptionist beamed up at her. "Your duties have been expanded." Ilishnish sighed. "Congratulations, sister." Hegenmull joined in and looked over to the vampire bride excitedly. "What does she get?" "Based on our review of your performance," the vampire bride replied, "we've decided to put you on the supply run between E-Rantel and Theorizo. Initially, we set a trio of other dragons to the task, but the two of you will deliver far more overtime by comparison. This delivery needs to be dropped off at Theorizo first, after which you will continue on to E-Rantel where you will spend your day off before assuming the new route. You mentioned that you knew where all the dwarf cities here were, yes?" "I've been there several times," Ilishnish replied, "but I highly doubt Hegenmull will fit into that pathetic hole in the wall. Unlike the three other dwarf cities, their outposts long ago links in a major trade route between the once thriving human lands on either side of the Azalizia Mountains. Theorizo was originally established as an out-of-the-way mining settlement that shipped its products to feed the industry of Theorizo. Its buildings were designed simply, for utility, with no thought towards replicating the grand architecture that could be observed in the capital of the Dwarf Kingdom. The city was treated solely as a place that housed and serviced those excavating the rich veins of ore in the area, therefore a surface presence was unneeded. With the Quagga no longer a threat, the more convenient underground routes between Theorizo and the dwarf cities to the north were free to be used again in relative safety, so all of the traffic would resume on the old subterranean highways. The only way in through the surface was through a fissure in the icy mountainside, followed by a series of passages that eventually led down to the city itself. "The arrangements have already been seen to," the vampire bride told her. "A temporary office for our service has been raised outside, in front of the passage leading to Theorizo." The two other vampire brides finished fastening their delivery and stepped back to stand with the receptionist. "Have a safe journey," they said in unison. Ilishnish took off from the wall of the trading outpost, followed by Hegenmull. Out of the corner of her eye, she watched a frost giant on an outcropping not a kilometer away observe their departure. The local tribe appeared to be getting bolder. With the last of the spring storms receding and impatience over returning to their capital mounting, the dwarves with fewer possessions were starting to travel in increasing numbers on foot, presenting a slow and soft target for swift mountain raiders. The caravans with the Soul Eaters were more than strong enough to repel what she had seen gather so far, but there was more than enough time to attack the dwarves traveling independently between them. "How far is Theorizo?" Hegenmull asked as they leveled off. 2 hours away, at this rate, Ilishnish replied. "We'll need to be careful on the way down. We won't have all this traffic keeping things distracted and at a distance, so there could be ambushes and such set up for us since we've been so reliably operating on this nice and predictable schedule." "Why, you mean they're back?" Her brother tried looking in all directions at once again. "What do you mean they are back?" she said incredulously. "They never left. There are probably 3 times as many now." "Really? I didn't notice." "I'm beginning to think that you won't notice anything unless you're so close that your blind sight picks it up." "But then it'd be too late?" Hegenmull frowned. "That's my point." Ilishnish snapped as she peered down at the peaks ahead. "Far from being safe, this service makes us so ridiculously vulnerable that I'm fairly certain you'll just get eaten by something one of these days." With an irritated scowl, Ilishnish tucked in her wings, abruptly diving towards an outcropping of rock 1,000 meters below. "Sister?" Hegenmull's voice floated down weakly after her. Her silent descent ended at a stand of trees, where she yanked an oblivious frost giant off of the ground, using her momentum to hurl it out from the mountainside. The frost giant gave a long cry as she fell to the rocks far below, bouncing several times off of the cliff face along the way. The massive form smashed into the ground, sliced open by the jagged reception of a rocky gulch, innards spilling out everywhere on impact. "See?" Ilishnish said as she leveled out after ascending back to join her shocked brother. "They're all over the place, though these ones have been so preoccupied with looking down at everything that's going on they don't bother looking up anymore. Those that are actually a challenge won't be so oblivious." Considering you just killed one of them, won't they come for revenge? Hegenmull stared down at the remains of the frost giant. Revenge? I suppose if there was some personal stake involved, if any of the others even noticed. No one would waste time and effort seeking vengeance for an easily killed idiot, however. Well, that wasn't exactly true, but the few times she had been confronted by a vengeful frost giant over such an idiot, they had been an idiot as well. It wasn't very hard to dispatch such empty-headed opponents. I guess you're the expert here, sister. By the way, if a frost giant got me, would you come to seek revenge? Elishnish rolled her eyes. Don't be an idiot, brother. They carried on in silence and, about an hour and a half later, they were circling over the entrance of Theorizo. Elishnish carefully examined the landscape below. An impromptu outpost had been constructed out of packed snow and piled stones gathered from the surroundings. The same flag she had seen fluttering from the towers of E-Rantel rose over the wind-swept highland moor. In the shadows of the ridge looming over the entrance of the dwarf city skulked yet another frost giant, who seemed intent on observing the proceedings on the ground. Elishnish glowered down at the figure. Do they not see them or do they just not care? She muttered. What about? Hegenmull asked. There's another one of those giants over the fissure leading into Theorizo, Elishnish answered. Giant? Hegenmull squinted down. Fissure? I can't believe you, brother, Elishnish sighed. That fissure isn't even trying to hide. Well, she certainly didn't want a frost giant staring straight down at her while she was on the ground. A few minutes later, it came plummeting down, landing right beside a group of dwarves who jumped up with startled shouts at the impact. Elishnish landed over its broken form, throwing up clouds of drifting snow over the rocky landscape. The vampire bride waiting at the front of the outpost came running towards her, strips of diaphanous alabaster cloth fluttering in the wind. What are you doing? She called out to her. Population control, Elishnish replied lightly. The frost giant groaned and stirred weakly beneath her, and Elishnish casually slashed his throat out. Blood blossomed on its pale, unkempt beard, spattering the fresh snow and pooling on the ground. She flicked the small amount on her claws away to the side as she watched her surroundings for reactions from any other frost giants that might be nearby. Would you like some Jotun? Elishnish asked the vampire bride. It's fresh. The vampire bride stepped forward, leaning forward to dip her finger into the expanding pool of blood. She popped it into her mouth and made a face. It's not very good, she said. I find that there isn't much to relish, myself, Elishnish agreed, and looked towards the stout figures nearby. You there, with the beard? The dwarves that had gathered around the fallen frost giant all simultaneously pointed to themselves with a question on their faces. I will exchange this kill here with you, she told them. I don't care how you split it. The stout figures traded sidelong glances at one another. She didn't know if they were together or not. Actually, it was better if they weren't, since competing interests would probably ensure that they didn't collude on such short notice. Could you give us a bit here? One of the dwarves asked as he eyed the corpse. You have about 5 minutes before I head out, she answered. I'll be at the vampire post. Hegenmull had already landed and was being unloaded when she padded up to the delivery outpost. He eyed her warily as she stopped in front of him. I didn't know I had such a vicious sister, he said. You're the one that's too soft, she retorted, in more ways than one. Are you saying the entire brood just casually kills frost giants like that? Hegenmull said in clear disbelief. I hardly think they'd be considered our competition if that was the case. Well, I don't fly around with the others like we've been doing for the past few weeks, so how should I know? I did say that ones like that are easy to pick off, though. These are all just weak, inexperienced scouts, expendable to their masters, and looking for ways to distinguish themselves. The strong ones won't leave their tribal strongholds unless they have good reason to. How strong do these strong ones get? Maybe there's a few nearly as strong as our parents were, Elishnish said as a vampire bride crawled up her shoulder to remove the bags, but the real problem is that there are a whole lot more of them than us. That's why father was afraid of them, no? But father said he wasn't afraid of the frost giants. Well, he's an idiot if he actually thought that, she snorted, and you're an idiot for believing such a ridiculous thing. Why do you think he even founded our enclave in the first place? Being the weakest amongst dragonkind, individual frost dragons were cautious in unfamiliar situations and generally nursed an inferiority complex. Poking at it usually led to an unkindly reaction. Olisur Dark had recognized their race's tenuous hold over the Azalizia Mountains, which was why he had gathered his mates and established a communal lair in Fioburkana. Ilishnish respected her father for having such an inspired vision for their future, so this revelation that he had not actually come to grips with his own nature was something of a disappointment. I suppose that makes sense. Does that mean you're scared of them too, sister? These weakling scouts and hunters aren't something to fear, she told him, but you won't catch me anywhere near the more powerful ones. I wouldn't even think of getting close to one of their strongholds. How many of us do you think they've captured or killed over the ages? There's no way to tell, really. Very few of us survive to adulthood, even with the Enclave, and there's a lot of things we can be eaten by before then. Who was eaten and who was captured is entirely up in the air. Well, my point is that even if we can easily kill these young and inexperienced ones that haven't proven themselves to their respective tribes yet, it doesn't mean that all frost giants are that weak. Driving them out of the mountains entirely would take millennia. Our enclave would need to be many times its size unless an exceptional individual is born one day, but that can just as easily happen for the frost giants as well. Thankfully one of those doesn't exist, I think. You're not trying to be one of those exceptional individuals, sister? Me? How can that be? The legendary great worms of old, according to Mother, commanded magics that we can't even harness today. You'd have to be able to do that much, at least. I'm just trying to get strong enough that I won't get eaten by adventurers immediately after leaving the safety of home. The vampire bride hopped off of her, carrying away the infinite haversacks in her arms, and Ilishnish looked over at Hegenmull, who was similarly bare of all but one of his magical containers. We're not taking anything to E-Rantel? She asked. There's nothing to deliver from here for now, so no. One of the vampire brides replied, we're keeping this set of bags here so we can prepare future transfers in advance if necessary. The main hub for the network is Fioburkana, however, so I expect that any outgoing shipments to E-Rantel will be from there. Have a safe journey. Hegenmull shuffled out in front of her and let out a startled cry when he nearly stepped on the dwarves patiently waiting outside. Ilishnish shook her head, maybe her brother was doomed to be oblivious. He wobbled precariously on his right legs as he hopped forward awkwardly to avoid them before plowing headfirst into a snowdrift. Ilishnish popped out of the office after her brother. Have you decided on your offer? She asked. The dwarves turned away from looking at Hegenmull's tail, which was sticking out of the snow, to face her. Well, the equipment wasn't magical, one with a dark, grey, beard answered, so it'll be good to break down for raw materials. Wasn't much else, though. We'll take it all for 6 gold coins. What about the corpse? The corpse? He blinked. Surely it's worth something, she explained. You have lizards to feed, yes? Then there's the skin and bones. You said you didn't like the taste, though? Are you implying something? Ilishnish leaned forward, peering down at the handful of dwarves. The first dwarf looked to the others for a moment, then grunted. Fine, he said. 12 gold pieces. Who'd have known a frost dragon would know what's worth what? She supposed that, in his ignorance over what she knew, it was worth the attempt. She couldn't fault the dwarf for trying. He dropped the coins into Ilishnish's outstretched claws, and she tossed them into her bag. Pleasure doing business, he said. I'd shake on it, but that seems just a wee bit dangerous. You going to bring in giants every time you arrive? Only if they're stupid enough to come close like that, Ilishnish replied. Guess we'll have to keep an eye out for falling giants then. The dwarves left to attend to their new purchase, and Hegenmull finally escaped from the snowdrift, falling backwards with a whumph. Not only was he terrible in the air, but he also seemed to be bad on his feet and incapable of burrowing at any decent speed as well. They were all things that frost dragons were naturally capable of. She wondered if he would become the first frost dragon to ever drown if he was dumped into the sea. His brother glanced at the backs of the dwarves heading off towards the mountain fissure, then back to the bag strapped onto Ilishnish. Wow, Hegenmull marveled at her. Getting paid for killing a random stranger that you came across, you're just like an adventurer. Ilishnish shuddered at his comparison. Don't ever call your own dear sister such a dreadful thing, she told him. I have a day off in E-Rantel coming up, and I'm not going into the city like some impoverished whelp. That's right, isn't it? He said. I hope you will see to what I asked about, dear sister. Of course, dear brother. With the aid of Ilishnish's spellsongs, the trip to E-Rantel from the dwarven cities was drastically faster than their first one together weeks ago. She was mainly concerned that their flight time would cut into her day off, and hopeful that arriving early would add to it. Between throwing all the useful enchantments she thought would help onto Hegenmull, and the gains, or losses, rather, he had made over the long weeks he had spent working, they arrived over E-Rantel 11 hours after their departure from Theorizo. Dawn was approaching and, though the sun was visible from the heights at which they soared, it had not yet crested the horizon to shed its light against the city walls far below. You're not landing, sister? Hegenmull looked up at his sister as he slowly descended. I'm taking a better look at the city first, she replied. I want to at least see the entire layout of this place from above before trying to explore it on the ground. Ah, that makes sense, Hegenmull yawned. Just don't fly too low over to the rooftops, a lich might come up and yell at you. I'll be going on ahead then, maybe I can finally get a decent nap. His statement held the uncomfortable ring of truth to it. The trading outpost above Theorizo was filled with the clamor of its constant traffic, and the office at Theorizo was many times worse. The ramshackle hoardings on the narrow inner wall of E-Rantel at least put some distance between themselves and the city streets. It was much nicer than. Ilishnish shook her head violently, scowling down at the makeshift shelter. She recalled the small pens and even smaller broom closet that she was forced to live in. It was not nice. She and her kin were being subjected to utterly dismal conditions. She needed to find a way to improve her lot, to get away before her will crumbled away as it had with the others, and she settled into a dreary life of acceptance as something treated with no more care than a golem or undead minion. Lowering herself to an altitude that allowed her to take in the features of the city in clear detail, it wasn't until the glow of the sun washed over the battlements of E-Rantel that she was satisfied that she had seen everything about the layout of the city that she could from above. Making her final approach to the wall, she noted Kilistran near the front desk being prepared for a delivery. Even after weeks of seeing a similar situation with the rest of her siblings and half-siblings, it still grated on her nerves to see an elder dragon being reduced to nothing more than a freight haulier. Mother, Ilishnish greeted Kilistran testily as she alighted on the open stretch of wall in front of the hoardings. Daughter, Kilistran replied. Welcome home. Ilishnish splayed her talons and dug them into the stone, but decided not to waste her breath on a retort. Have you seen what's happening up north? She asked instead. Up until now, I've been assigned to deliveries to either Theorizo or Theorizo. They seem to alternate. Agricultural produce, mostly, I believe. Ilishnish resisted the impulse to sniff at the containers being strapped onto Kilistran. Using such valuable items on dragons to deliver cheap grain and greens was beyond her comprehension. Surely they had better things to do than torture them with this drudgery. Still, she took it as a good sign that someone else had gained even a slight interest in the world beyond bleakly staring at nothing in particular. You're keeping track of what you're carrying? Ilishnish tilted her head to eye her mother. Well, if you're carrying some unknown things for days, you're bound to become curious as to what it is, no? I suppose. We spend mere minutes on the ground every day, Ilishnish snorted as she complained to her mother. I can't believe how willing they are to run us ragged like this. Hegenmull's in a state of near collapse at every stop. It is good for him, he could stand to lose all that excess weight, Kilistran replied. I doubt you were ever even slightly winded after weeks of flying back and forth. You've become quite strong compared to everyone else, though even I can't imagine why you learn some of the magic that you do. Kilistran's head slowly tilted downward as she watched her daughter assume the appearance of a human female with a head of lustrous, frost-white hair. The magical accessories she wore scaled down to fit her new shape, save for the ring on her tail which somehow ended up on one of her fingers. Her stomach growled. It was the ring of sustenance. She considered changing out the ring of regeneration for it. Then again, she could see what sort of fare the city offered now that she had some time to herself. I thought it would be useful for whenever I left the enclave to see the world, Ilishnish replied as she fussed over her appearance. Now my efforts are paying off and I can go explore this human city. How do I look, mother? Like a human, Kilistran said dismissively, "You've taken more interest in observing this city and its people than I hardly care at all beyond accidentally squashing one of them and getting into trouble." "I should have frosted up a wall to turn into a mirror," Elishnish muttered, combing her fingers through an unfamiliar head of hair. "If anyone asks, let them know I'm in the city. I would rather not have a swarm of these undead chasing me around like I'm some sort of fugitive." "I will let one of the employees know before I head off," her mother replied. "Be careful out there, dear. I hear there's a whole nest of adventurers in the city that are aggressively searching for better equipment. I don't want to find out that my most promising child was turned into a pair of boots." "I doubt anyone would notice me, Mother," Elishnish said as she walked away to the edge of the wall and hopped off. "Oh, and if you find anything nice," Kilistran's voice followed down after her, "please remember your poor old mother. They took everything away, they did." Her mother's mournful tone triggered a pang of loss over her own belongings. Whoever these people were, she had long learned that they certainly had no care for a dragon's mental health. The other members of the Enclave had been cowed into submission, and they were no longer the proud and lively kindred that she once knew. Most only clung to their sanity through the valuable items that they were equipped with as they listlessly flew from post to post. None had the essential comfort of the personal hoards of treasure that they spent their lives accumulating. Elishnish hesitated as she stood in the shadow of the wall, poking her head out cautiously into the morning light to look up and down the street. A large undead sentry that stood almost half again as tall as herself looked over in her direction, and she scurried away over the cobblestones before it decided to come investigate. Though it had been weeks since she was last in the city, the demi-human quarter was still in the initial phases of its construction and sparsely populated. Within the confines of the city walls, a terraced bowl had been fashioned, and each section of the quarter would meet the needs of different races. The city walls themselves could be considered the upper level of the demi-human quarter, reserved for species capable of flight who desired high, safe places to make their homes. The frost dragons had been allocated the southern wall that separated the quarter from the central district, but, aside from them, it seemed no other beings were making use of the battlements yet. The ground level of the demi-human quarter was mostly bare of features beyond its basic layout, and a bare handful of other races could be seen. The bottom of the bowl was occupied by a small lake, and several additional groups of lizardmen had constructed dwellings along its shore. In the middle of the lake was an island that still appeared to be unoccupied, save for several saplings that someone had recently planted. Goblins and ogres had set up a camp of some sort in the temperate middle sections, and a few dwarves could be seen milling about various parts of the earthworks. Occupying a large area near to the western entrance of the quarter was the only permanent-looking group of buildings so far, though, upon closer inspection, the entire complex that she had noted after her initial arrival to E-Rantel did not appear to be fully completed yet. From here was where those females that the vampire brides deferred to came out of, and other tiny figures of indeterminate nature scurried about within making unsettling noises. Elishnish gave the strange facility a wide berth as she crossed into the common area of the city. The contrast between one side of the gatehouse and the other was quite stark. The hubbub of city life filled the street and humans of both genders milled about for reasons Elishnish could not yet discern. She adroitly wove her way down the street, her blind sight offering a perfect awareness of the activity in a wide area around her. As she did not need to rely on her vision to navigate her surroundings, her head turned this way and that to take in the sights as she strolled by. Aimlessly meandering through the city, she allowed her senses to lead her wherever she thought she might find something interesting or valuable, traversing both busy streets and dark alleys as she went. Something seemed off, however. Wherever she went, gazes followed her. Eventually, she stopped in a shadowed alcove to figure out why before adventurers noticed and harvested her to fashion equipment out of. It was the first time she had assumed a human guise, but she didn't think she had committed any major errors. As her mother had said, she had observed the denizens of the city thoroughly, and her current appearance was a result of those careful observations. Elishnish had fashioned the appearance of a humanoid female, or at least she assumed it was female. Between the dwarves and the vampire brides, she was not sure which was more so. Just in case, she had confirmed it by sneaking near to a few humans gathered around a produce stand and sniffing them discreetly. After that, she withdrew to a secluded alley to refine her appearance by imitating the ones who seemed to carry themselves with the greatest degree of confidence. No scales were showing on her skin, no tail behind her nor horns on her head. She felt her teeth, they seemed to be fine as well. Humans had a terrible sense of smell, so she didn't think it had anything to do with scent. Her clothing matched what was commonly worn to help her blend in. She even wore shoes and stockings under her long, soft dress. The amount of attention she was receiving was far more than what she had experienced in Theorizo, and the scrutiny did not mesh well with her reclusive frost dragon nature in this strange place. Her instincts kept her jumpy and defensive. Ultimately unable to discern what was wrong no matter how much she examined herself, Ilishnish continued on her way, plastering a friendly expression on her face while plagued by the sense that she was sticking out somehow to attract so much attention. The feeling lessened as she made her way into a large, crowded plaza. She noted that humans seemed to rely primarily on their poor eyesight and dull hearing to register the world beyond their reach, so mingling into large crowds greatly limited their ability to notice her by the same measure. Able to finally relax somewhat, she slipped into the flow of pedestrians and continued to observe her surroundings. Everywhere she went, it appeared that humans were exchanging their valuables for items. She supposed it was the trade that she had read about, seen glimpses of in Theorizo, and tried imitating outside of Theorizo. Having not experienced human trade herself, however, she couldn't be sure. Coins flowed one way, while items flowed back, so good, so far. Sometimes coins flowed back as well. Relying on her treasure sense to measure the value of various exchanges, Ilishnish became greatly confused. Very little made sense. Why was wood or food worth copper? Why was silver being exchanged for cloth? Though she had exchanged her kill in front of Theorizo for some gold coins, the exact reasoning for the values in the exchange were beyond her. There were a few that she thought made more sense, and then there were transactions that offended her outright. Her mouth fell open when she witnessed 3 gold coins being traded for some sort of cheap glass object, and she fought to keep the bile rising in her throat down. One thing she did come to understand was that, even if she found something that she wanted, she had very few gold coins to exchange and no real sense of what anything was worth to these strange creatures. The frost dragons had been explicitly ordered not to raid or plunder the places of the sorceress kingdom and the dwarven territories that they flew over, so her entire extended family remained similarly impoverished. Since there were no memories she could refer to in order to discern what humans considered important, Ilishnish didn't even have a sense of what mattered to them the most. She pondered her conundrum as she continued to make her way through the bright stalls and crowded pathways until she finally settled on some questions to ask. Stopping in front of a human female, who was wiping the sweat off of her brow before a set of crates, Ilishnish cleared her throat several times and tested her voice before raising it to address her.